Matt Riggs didn't care much for drama. He was the kind of man who believed in straight lines, both in his workshop and in his life. He owned a mid-sized repair business specializing in agricultural machinery, the kind that kept the outskirts of the county running during long harvest seasons. By the time he moved into his new home, a corner lot with a gently sloping lawn that curved around 2 streets, he was ready for peace. The house wasn't fancy, but it had structure. A solid garage, space for tools, and, more importantly, a wide patch of green that he had every intention of restoring with care. There was something deeply satisfying about cutting a clean line through fresh sod or laying out precise irrigation patterns. It was, in his words, working with a cooperative enemy. The first few weeks were uneventful. Matt kept to himself, spoke politely to neighbors when he ran into them, and gradually brought the lawn back from its half-dead state into a rich, organized grid of deep green grass and low, ornamental borders. He didn't do it to impress anyone. If anything, he did it because he valued what he could control, and his land was something he could. He planted small flowering shrubs near the corners, placed solar lights in just the right spots, and installed a single camera near the front door, not to spy, but to watch deliveries and occasionally check the weather. Matt wasn't a recluse. He just didn't believe his private space should be anyone's business but his own. Then came the first mark. It was subtle. A faint depression in the lawn running diagonally from one end to the other, like someone had dragged a suitcase or taken a soft, shuffling shortcut across the grass. At first, he dismissed it as an animal trail or maybe a kid cutting through once on a bike. He straightened the crushed blades, watered the spot a little more, and moved on. But the next morning, the line was back, deeper this time, more defined. This wasn't a one-off. Someone was deliberately walking across his lawn day after day, and it wasn't a casual step. It was a repeated pattern. Matt found a muddy tread near the border where the lawn dipped slightly toward the curb. A woman's footprint from a narrow athletic shoe, faded pink with a deeply worn heel. He didn't like making assumptions, but it wasn't hard to figure out who it belonged to. He had noticed her before, a woman in her early 60s, power walking around the neighborhood every morning just past 7, clutching a large insulated bottle, earbuds in, never making eye contact. Her posture had that self-important tilt that made people move out of her way even if she didn't speak. She wore neon jackets, expensive sneakers, and that air of brisk authority that certain people in suburban communities cultivated like a badge. Karen. He didn't know her last name, but everyone just called her Karen. And from the way people avoided stepping on her toes during block association chats or street-side garbage debates, Matt figured she had some kind of standing in the local neighborhood committee, whatever unofficial power that might have granted. On the third morning, Matt stood near his mailbox, sipping coffee and waiting. Sure enough, right on time, Karen appeared, striding up the sidewalk with the exact confidence he had imagined. When she reached the edge of his property, she didn't hesitate. She turned onto the grass like it was a public path, crossed diagonally without looking at him, and stepped off onto the adjacent sidewalk without breaking pace. Matt watched her go, stunned by the sheer casualness of it. It wasn't a trespass in the sneaky sense. It was an act of complete disregard, like the lawn wasn't even there, like it was just a space she had claimed years ago and had no intention of negotiating over. Later that day, Matt placed a simple sign at the edge of his lawn. It wasn't hostile. It read, "Private property. Please use sidewalk." He staked it into the ground with a pair of gloves, took a step back, and nodded. It wasn't a trap or a fence, just a clear message. The next morning, the sign was gone. No wind could have carried it away. The metal stake was still in the ground, bent sideways, and a footprint had been pressed firmly next to it, the same tread as before. This time, Matt didn't wait by the mailbox. He watched the camera footage from the night before. At precisely 7:16 a.m., Karen stepped onto the lawn, paused briefly near the sign, pulled it up with one hand, looked around, and carried it off like it was garbage. Not a word. Not even a glance at the camera. Matt didn't rush to confrontation. That wasn't his style. Instead, he went back to work, asked around discreetly about how neighborhood issues were usually handled, and quickly learned that the committee, a loosely structured group of volunteers, mostly deferred to Karen. She had the longest tenure. She managed the newsletters and she spoke for the street in city zoning meetings, recycling campaigns, and sidewalk repair petitions. She had reach. Matt wasn't interested in starting a war, but he wasn't going to let someone claim parts of his land out of habit or ego. So he tried again, this time printing a firmer sign on aluminum, coated against weather, with a rubber base that would be harder to kick over. The morning after he installed it, he found it face down in the street with a dent in the corner. A note was taped to his door in thick marker. If you're so sensitive about your grass, maybe put up a real fence like adults do. Otherwise, learn to live like a neighbor. No name, but he didn't need one. It was Karen's handwriting, half cursive, half caps, perfectly self-righteous. Matt exhaled slowly and took the note inside. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. Some things could be solved with confrontation. Others required strategy. And Matt, while not the kind of man to throw punches, had never been one to retreat from his own ground. He understood boundaries, not just in property, but in principle. If someone ignored polite warnings and legal ownership, then it was time to move beyond kindness. That night, he began researching non-lethal animal deterrents. Not traps, not anything dangerous, just options, solutions used by gardeners and landscapers to keep deer, foxes, and raccoons from destroying beds and borders. There were dozens of tools on the market: motion sensor sprinklers, ultrasonic emitters, retractable posts triggered by movement or timers. Most were designed to deter animals, not people, but Matt wasn't looking to cause injury. He wanted interruption, a reminder that his lawn was not a public shortcut, that it was land with ownership. He ordered a retractable spike system, not sharp, not jagged, just enough to make walking over the wrong spot inconvenient. The kind used in flower gardens or at high-end resorts to discourage guests from cutting corners. They looked like small steel rods but retracted flush with the soil when not in use. It wasn't a trap. It was reinforcement. And it was legal. While waiting for delivery, Matt walked the perimeter of his lawn again. He checked the irrigation system, measured for depth, made sure the spike panels wouldn't interfere with underground lines. He worked methodically like he did in the shop, carefully, deliberately, planning not for confrontation, but for conclusion. The grass might have looked soft, but it was about to learn how to say no. As he knelt near the corner to adjust a sprinkler head, he glanced up. Across the street, Karen stood on her porch, sipping from that same insulated bottle, staring directly at him. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just watched, expression flat, posture rigid, like someone waiting for a challenge she believed she'd already won. Matt didn't react. He finished the adjustment, stood up slowly, and walked back to the garage. He didn't care for battles, but he never stepped away from his property. Not on principle, not ever. It had been 3 quiet mornings since Matt installed the retractable deterrent system. Not once had he seen a person cut across the lawn. The spikes, though subtle in design and virtually invisible when not deployed, had a presence. He had tested them himself, stepping cautiously, noting how they rose when someone crossed over the center path where they'd been installed. They didn't stab or cut, they merely disrupted the rhythm of walking, enough to make someone stumble, or at the very least reconsider their route. Matt hadn't felt triumphant. He wasn't out to humiliate anyone. He simply wanted to be left alone, to maintain the integrity of his property without being labeled difficult or territorial. For a moment, it seemed the message had gotten through. The signs were left untouched. The lawn remained pristine. The camera footage showed nothing more than shadows from trees swaying at dawn. Then, on the fourth day, something changed. At 7:15 a.m., the system triggered. The spikes rose and immediately retracted, the way they were designed to, and the motion alert pinged Matt's phone while he was drinking coffee in the shop office. Curious, he opened the app and scrolled back. There she was, Karen, walking straight across the lawn like nothing had changed, her bottle in hand, her pace brisk and unfazed. But instead of the casual stride from before, there was a hesitation in her step, a flicker of imbalance like she had encountered something unfamiliar underfoot and had tried to mask her reaction. She didn't fall. She didn't stop. But at the edge of the lawn, she turned back, looked directly at the camera, and smiled. Not a warm smile, a knowing one. Later that day, Matt returned from a supply run and noticed something strange. The retractable system wasn't responding to his presence. He walked across the path deliberately. Nothing. He checked the control unit hidden near the base of his mailbox. It had been tampered with. The casing was scratched. The cable connections had been loosened. It wasn't vandalism in the juvenile sense. It was careful, practiced, and precise enough that if he hadn't checked, he might have assumed the system had simply glitched. That made Matt pause. Tampering with private property, especially electrical installations, wasn't something done lightly. Whoever had done it knew where to look and how to disable it without triggering alarms. That evening, Matt replaced the casing, rewired the connectors, and changed the passcode on the control panel. He didn't tell anyone. Not the police, not the neighbors. He wanted to see what would happen next. He activated the secondary timer mode, randomized deployment, and waited. The next morning, he received another alert. This time, when he played the footage, Karen had stumbled. Not a dramatic fall, but enough to cause a jolt. She caught herself on one leg, then angrily kicked at the grass. She reached down, felt the edge of the spike, yanked it once, twice, then stormed off the lawn and disappeared from frame. No blood, no damage, just frustration. By noon, Matt received a letter. It was typed on standard office paper, folded neatly, and placed in an unmarked envelope wedged between his doorframe and the screen door. The message was short. You're creating a hazard. You will be held responsible. Take it down, or the next step won't be civil. No name, no signature, just the threat, centered and bold. It wasn't written in Karen's handwriting, but it didn't need to be. The words had her rhythm. Clean, legalistic, threatening just enough to pretend to be reasonable. Matt held the letter for a long moment, then calmly placed it in a file folder in his office marked Disputes. He then checked the footage again. Sure enough, earlier that morning, Karen had returned briefly after her stumble. She stood at the corner of the lawn, arms crossed, scanned the yard like she was assessing the angle of something, then stepped off camera. No tools, no action, but the timing was too perfect. The moment she left, the system had gone quiet again. Another deliberate tampering attempt? Or something else? That evening, a white SUV pulled into his driveway without warning. A man in business casual attire stepped out, holding a leather binder and wearing a strained smile. He introduced himself as Dean Massey, a civil mediation coordinator, working on behalf of the Neighborhood Volunteer Committee, Karen's creation. He explained in a low, patient voice that there had been concerns raised about Matt's landscaping choices, particularly hidden hardware in pedestrian-accessible green space. He never used the word spikes. He never said Karen. He talked around the issue like it was an unfortunate misunderstanding between adults who surely wanted the same thing: harmony. Matt listened without interrupting. When Massey finished his spiel and asked if Matt would consider a compromise, such as converting the lawn into a more walkable-friendly buffer or installing non-disruptive alternatives, Matt asked a single question. "Did you bring a formal complaint?" Massey blinked. "No, this is strictly informal, a conversation." Matt nodded, then opened the gate and gestured to the sidewalk. "Then we're done here." Massey hesitated, his polished shoes refusing to turn. "Look," he said, softening his tone, "no one wants this to become something bigger. I think if you remove whatever's under there, the rest of the board would be more open to approving your upcoming toolshed permit." Matt smiled for the first time that day. "I'm not applying for a shed permit." Massey's smile faded. "Oh, my mistake. Still, there's always future cooperation." Matt didn't reply. Massey lingered a moment longer, then returned to his SUV and left without another word. The next morning, Matt's lawn had been defaced. Someone had poured coarse salt across 2 flower beds and along the edge of the grass where the motion spikes had been buried. It wasn't a teenager's prank. This was deliberate. Salt poisoned the soil long term. It was meant to kill, to leave a mark. The lawn would need to be dug up, the soil replaced, and reseeded. Not something that would go unnoticed by the other neighbors, especially those who had commented on how clean Matt's place always looked. It wasn't just an act of spite. It was psychological, subtle violence masked as consequences. Matt didn't take photos. He didn't post about it. He simply cleared the affected areas, bagged the contaminated soil, and drove it to the landfill himself. He replaced the most damaged section with fresh rolls of sod. He didn't report it because he knew that without footage or a witness, it would become another circular conversation. But he did order a backup camera kit with hidden pinhole units that would cover blind spots from the main system. 2 days later, Karen returned. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't a walk by. She stopped at the edge of the property and stood there. When Matt stepped out onto the porch, she smiled and said, "You're very committed to the whole no trespassing image." Matt said nothing. She added, "There's a saying, you know, if you don't want a path walked, don't place it in the middle of a shortcut." He replied evenly, "You walk through the wrong yard, eventually the yard walks back." Karen tilted her head and said, "We'll see who gets tired first." That was the moment Matt realized this wasn't about a lawn anymore. It wasn't even about territory. This was about precedent. Karen had built her authority on casual control. Nudges, notes, little pressures that most people didn't fight. Matt's refusal to yield, to apologize, or to remove the deterrence had exposed a weakness in her structure. If he stood his ground and won, others might stop deferring to her. She couldn't afford that, and she wouldn't stop. Matt knew now what was coming would be worse. Not louder, but sharper, smarter, less visible and more dangerous. The silence that followed Karen's warning wasn't peace. It was pressure, the kind that settled over a place like low cloud cover, unnoticed at first, but thickening with time until every breath felt just a little heavier. Matt returned to routine, but nothing about it felt routine anymore. He found himself checking the cameras not once a day but multiple times, scanning for unfamiliar silhouettes, odd movement, anything slightly out of rhythm. He began parking his truck a few feet further back in the driveway, closer to the house. He didn't consciously decide to do that. He just did, and when he realized it, he didn't change it. There was a current in the air now, a slow pulse of hostility that didn't announce itself but also didn't need to. It wasn't just Karen's fixation that unsettled him. It was the way the neighborhood began shifting around it. A week after the salt incident, a letter arrived from the county. It was an official notification of an anonymous complaint filed regarding unauthorized structural installations on visible residential terrain. The language was vague, almost bureaucratically hollow, but the meaning was clear. It was about the retractable spike system. Matt read through it slowly, noted the listed municipal codes and the demand for documentation proving the installations met safety standards and posed no threat to public passage. The catch, of course, was that no one was supposed to be using that section of the lawn for passage. It was private property. The notion that a resident needed to justify preventing access to his own lawn was absurd. Still, Matt gathered what he had: product specifications, installation layout, photo evidence of the posted signage, and sent a reply through his attorney. He didn't mention the cameras in that reply, or that the tampering had continued. Twice more that week, the system had been manually disabled. The second time, someone had cut power to the transformer box that controlled the outer range. That required tools, time, and knowledge of what to target without triggering a full system alert. It wasn't vandalism, it was sabotage. Matt installed a backup battery supply and routed the transformer into a locked casing. Then he installed a second unit behind a false panel. If someone wanted to keep interfering, they were going to start running out of options, but not out of allies. The next escalation came through conversation, as it so often does in suburban warfare. Matt was adjusting one of his front sprinklers when a neighbor from 3 houses down strolled by with his Labrador. Dennis was the kind of man who always nodded, always had a neutral opinion, the sort of community fixture who never took sides but always seemed to know which side was winning. On this morning, Dennis paused near the sidewalk and gave Matt a look that could be mistaken for concern. "You know," he said casually, "some folks think you're overreacting." It's just a shortcut, after all. Matt didn't look up. "My lawn's not a shortcut." Dennis shrugged. "I get it, but you've got people nervous now. Those spike things, the lights, all the hardware. Not everyone's comfortable with that kind of perimeter." Perimeter? The word sat between them like a verdict. Matt stood slowly, wiped his hands on a rag, and met Dennis's eyes. If they're nervous about stepping on someone else's land, they probably should be. Dennis opened his mouth, then thought better of it and moved on. It was a small moment, but it was telling. Karen had shifted the narrative. Matt wasn't the man protecting his home anymore. He was the man building barricades. Defensive became aggressive. Private became suspicious. And once those gears started turning in a community, they were hard to stop. 2 days later, another letter. This one from the so-called Street Stewardship Group, an unofficial collection of residents that worked adjacent to the city's neighborhood improvement initiative. It wasn't enforceable, but it had weight. The letter was polite, dripping with phrases like neighborhood cohesion and shared values. But the intent was clear. They were pressuring him to remove the metallic deterrents and create a more inviting landscape in line with the area's open space philosophy. There were no signatures, just a generic heading and a contact number that rang to a voicemail inbox. Matt ignored it. But ignoring didn't slow the momentum. The following weekend, while unloading parts from the back of his truck, he noticed 2 unfamiliar men walking the property line with tablets. They were in plain clothes, khakis, polo shirts, generic sneakers, but they moved with intent. One took photos, the other pointed and made notes. When Matt approached, they introduced themselves as part of a contracted landscaping audit team, working on behalf of the local Greenway Advisory Board. No badges, no identification. When Matt asked who authorized the audit, they vaguely referenced an open case report related to community accessibility and landscaping concerns. It was bullshit, but sophisticated bullshit. Just enough red tape language to make a man question what he could or couldn't stop. Matt told them to leave. One of them asked if he had a permit for the underground units. That's when Matt closed the tailgate of his truck with a loud, deliberate slam. "You've got 10 seconds to get off my property," he said. They left without argument, but not without smirks. That night, a motion alert woke Matt at 3:17 a.m. He checked the live feed. Nothing but trees. But when he reviewed the motion capture footage, it showed something else. 3 quick flashes near the edge of the yard, light reflecting off something metallic. It could have been nothing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been checking, watching, waiting for a moment when the house was quiet, when response time might be slow. That was when Matt realized the real danger wasn't Karen directly. It was the soft power structure she had built over years. Whispers, committees, indirect influence that could wear a man down without ever confronting him head-on. But Matt wasn't built to fold under pressure. He documented everything. He photographed the strangers, saved the footage, logged the letters. He didn't go to war. He didn't stand on a soapbox. He simply started building a case, not for the city, not for the neighbors, but for himself. Because if it came to a legal battle, or worse, he would have more than opinion on his side. He would have facts. Still, the pressure didn't let up. The next morning, someone dumped a bag of raw garbage in the middle of his yard. Chicken bones, soggy paper towels, wet cardboard. Matt reviewed the tape and found nothing. Either the camera had been blocked or the person had approached from a blind spot. He cleaned it without complaint but left the bag out front near the curb in full view. A statement without words. Later that afternoon, a woman from the city's sanitation compliance office stopped by unannounced, stating that someone had reported excessive waste accumulation on the property. Matt didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth lifted. Oh. He invited her to inspect the entire lot. She found nothing, issued no warning, but she took photos, and he knew those photos would end up in someone's email inbox by nightfall. That was the first time Matt sat at his kitchen table and wrote out, in full, a timeline of events. Not for drama, not for court, for clarity. He needed to know what happened and when, who had approached, what had changed, where the pressure points had been applied. It helped him see the pattern. Each time Karen was challenged, she escalated through someone else. Never directly. Always layered, always buffered by structure. So he adjusted his own structure. He consulted an attorney, not the one who handled the earlier reply, but a different kind, one who specialized in land use harassment. They spoke quietly, privately, and Matt shared the timeline, the footage, the letters. The attorney asked questions about public easements, about HOA agreements, which notably Matt had opted out of when buying the property, and about evidence of tampering. She told him 2 things. First, he was on solid legal ground. Second, the pressure would get worse before it got better. And it did. The very next day, Matt's mailbox was found twisted open, the door bent sideways, hinges cracked. The mail inside had been soaked in something pungent, possibly ammonia. It wasn't theft. It was a message. Not just to Matt, but to the delivery drivers, the neighbors, anyone passing by. Someone wanted to make this place look like a problem. And that's when Matt knew. This wasn't about a lawn. This was about power. And it wasn't going to end with a conversation. It had been over a month since the first footprint appeared on Matt Riggs' lawn. And by now, the tension wasn't something he noticed. It was something he lived inside of. The routine had hardened into a rhythm of containment and observation. Each morning he checked the motion logs. Each evening he walked the perimeter of his property in silence, checking for signs. Footprints in the softened edges of the grass, shifted pebbles on the path, disturbances in the mulch line that he could trace back to familiar patterns. Karen had stopped speaking to him directly, which was no great loss. But what concerned Matt more than anything was how quiet the rest of the street had become. Neighbors who used to nod now avoided eye contact altogether. One of them, an older woman with a poodle and a nose for gossip, had crossed to the other side of the street the last time he stepped onto the sidewalk. Matt wasn't surprised. That was how rot worked. It spread slow, quiet, and internal, until people began assuming that silence was the safest position. Still, he wasn't alone. The attorney he'd hired, a sharp-tongued woman named Gloria Withers, had been methodically building the case, item by item, date by date. Gloria didn't deal in assumptions. She wanted hard proof, and Matt had been supplying it in abundance. Photos, timestamps, footage, incident records. She was impressed by the level of documentation, but more so by his refusal to lash out emotionally. "This," she said, "is how you outlast people like her. Not by shouting louder, but by surviving better." Matt didn't say anything to that. He didn't need slogans. He needed results. Then came the day the city truck parked across from his driveway. It arrived just after lunch, unmarked except for a generic Department of Urban Services decal on the driver's side door. Two men in safety vests stepped out, rolled a measuring tape from the curb to the start of Matt's lawn, then began marking the edge of his grass with bright orange paint. Matt watched them from the porch, waited until they finished their third mark, then walked out calmly and asked what they were doing. One of them, clearly trying to stay neutral, informed him that a request had been filed to reassess public access to a pedestrian corridor, and that this property, his lawn, was listed as a possible access point. Matt asked who filed the request. The worker gave a shrug and a generic answer. "Community petition. Names redacted. We just go where the orders send us." Matt nodded, stepped back inside, and called Gloria. She was already aware. Apparently, the request had been filed 2 weeks ago under a blanket initiative connected to a proposed Greenway Enhancement Project that sought to integrate walkable microroutes through underutilized neighborhood spaces. On paper, it sounded like urban planning. In practice, it was an attempt to reclassify the corner of Matt's property as a transitional public access buffer, which would render the path Karen had been cutting as not only justified but potentially codified into law. If approved, he wouldn't just be fighting to protect his lawn. He'd be forced to dismantle the system, open the land to public foot traffic, and potentially even absorb legal costs associated with obstruction. But Gloria was prepared. She had seen this tactic before. The strength of Karen's move lay in its subtlety, in how it masked a personal vendetta behind the language of policy. But the weakness was that it still required compliance from the city. Gloria filed an emergency response, citing trespassing history, prior property use documentation, and photographic evidence of hostile tampering. She included the municipal code on legacy land rights, and she did so with a timing that intersected precisely with the window of public feedback. The next day, the workers returned, but this time they painted a line through the orange markings and drove away without laying new ones. That evening, Matt received a call. Not from Gloria, from someone he hadn't heard from before, someone who didn't leave a name. The voice was male, calm and low. "Just letting you know," it said, "some people in your area aren't going to take kindly to you stonewalling progress. You might want to think about scaling back. No need for things to get ugly." The call ended. No number, no caller ID, just the silence afterward, like a door left half open. Matt didn't tell Gloria about the call, not because he didn't think it mattered, but because he didn't want to risk it being framed as paranoia. Instead, he forwarded the audio to a private investigator she had connected him with during their second meeting. The man, a former property assessor with a background in dispute mediation, confirmed that the number had been routed through a disposable VoIP line. Impossible to trace, but Matt already knew that. He didn't care who had said it. He only cared that someone had. That week, the pressure intensified again. First came the bins, his trash and recycling containers, knocked over 3 nights in a row, always just before dawn. Then the package, a small, unmarked box left on the welcome mat. Inside, a pair of gardening gloves, sliced neatly across the palms. No note, just the message in the gesture. Matt handed it to the investigator, who ran prints. None. Clean as factory plastic. Then came the knock on the door. It was a woman Matt had never seen before. late 30s, dressed like a city inspector, but with no badge, no clipboard. She claimed she was conducting a survey about neighborhood access points, but her questions were sharp, invasive, oddly specific. How long have you owned the home? Do you consider yourself protective of your property? Have you ever used deterrents that could cause bodily harm? Matt didn't answer. He stepped back, asked for ID. She hesitated, then muttered something about just doing outreach, turned and left without looking back. The private investigator confirmed her description matched someone known to be affiliated with a private urban planning consulting firm, one that had been hired for several of Karen's prior projects in other parts of the county. That was when Matt and Gloria realized this wasn't just about harassment. This was groundwork. Karen wasn't trying to win an argument. She was building a case for eminent reclassification, using Matt's defense as a weapon against him. Every deterrent, every system, every reaction was being painted as obstruction, as overreaction, as anti-community. So Gloria made a move of her own. She filed a preemptive notice with the city attorney's office asserting Matt's right to deny public access to private land not designated by the state for open transition. She included video logs, timestamps, testimonies from adjacent homeowners who had experienced similar pressures in the past. She even arranged for a civil engineer to conduct a visibility and safety survey of the lawn to prove it offered no public benefit as a pathway. When the results came in, they were undeniable. The corner was more hazardous for pedestrians due to its slope and irrigation layout. No justification for access could hold up under review. For the first time, Matt saw something shift. The silence around him began to crack, not loudly, not with public apologies or handshakes, but in small gestures. A neighbor who hadn't spoken in weeks returned his wave. A delivery driver, previously wary, nodded and said, "Looks cleaner than most streets I run through." Even Dennis, who had once suggested Matt ease up, stopped by to quietly say he'd received a similar call about his fence line and was rethinking some things. And then came the city's decision. The pedestrian corridor proposal had been denied, formally, entirely, and without appeal. The reasoning was clear. There was no basis for a buffer zone, no history of public right-of-way, and the land was in proper compliance with all residential code. Matt wasn't just safe. He was now in legal possession of a ruling that could insulate him from future reclassification attempts. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was balance, a moment of equilibrium, where the pressure finally stopped mounting, where the storm pulled back and waited. Matt knew better than to believe it was over. But for the first time in weeks, he didn't watch the camera footage before bed. He simply turned off the lights, locked the door, and let himself sleep. The false calm that settled over Matt's property after the city's rejection of the pedestrian corridor proposal wasn't fooling him. He recognized it for what it was. A pause, not a retreat. Karen wasn't the kind of person who accepted bureaucratic defeat with grace. For someone like her, structure was only useful so long as it gave her control, and once that structure resisted her will, she would simply look for a softer wall to push. Matt didn't let his guard down. The cameras stayed on. The sensor logs stayed active. The backups continued to upload every night to encrypted cloud storage. But even with those precautions, he didn't expect the next move to come not through sabotage or a formal complaint, but through the slow, creeping edge of administrative warfare. It began with a letter from the tax assessor's office. At first glance, it appeared routine, an annual update form requesting confirmation of the property improvements. But the form included a section Matt had never seen before. Auxiliary utility systems installed after purchase date. Listed beneath it, highlighted in yellow, were 3 pre-filled entries: embedded deterrent system, perimeter lighting, and surveillance grid. That wasn't language you found on general county forms. It was precise, almost militaristic. Matt stared at it for a full minute before understanding what he was looking at. Someone had pre-registered information about his property without his knowledge, and now the city was using that data to reassess his home's taxable value under the justification of unreported additions. He called Gloria immediately. She was silent as he read the form aloud to her. Then she asked one question. "Did you ever register those systems as commercial-grade security?" Matt said no. He hadn't needed to. All of it was consumer-level, legal, and well within residential code. Gloria told him not to respond to the form yet. She needed to trace its origin. That process took 2 days. When she called back, her voice was tight. The data came from a private zoning analyst, third-party contractor, used to work with a redevelopment initiative in the county. Guess who's on their advisory board? Matt didn't have to guess. Karen. It wasn't illegal. That was the brilliance of it. Karen hadn't forged a document or lied under oath. She had simply flagged his property as an area of interest for public utility reconsideration, which allowed a contractor to visit under a community program initiative, and that visit had resulted in observational data being logged. That data was then used to prompt a secondary tax review. No one had broken a law, but what had been done was clear. It was harassment by bureaucracy, punishment by form. Gloria responded fast. She submitted a formal challenge to the pre-assessment data, demanded a freeze on the evaluation until a hearing could be held, and filed an ethics complaint with the County Development Board. But Matt knew what this really was. It was an opening salvo. Karen had moved beyond the lawn. Now she was targeting his time, his finances, and his mental bandwidth. He adapted accordingly. He stopped taking walk-in repairs at the shop. He moved his records to encrypted drives. He began keeping a log not only of incidents but of his own reactions, in case someone tried to paint him as unstable. And then, just when he began to get ahead of the chaos, the real escalation landed, in the form of construction equipment. It was early Thursday when the sound began. A diesel engine idling, hydraulic arms groaning, gravel crunching under heavy tires. Matt stepped out and saw them. 2 trucks, a skid steer, and 3 men unloading equipment onto the strip of public easement across from his property. There were cones, warning signs, and laminated notices pinned to the wooden power pole at the corner. Approved Infrastructure Access Project. Curb Restructuring and Drainage Review. Matt walked up to the foreman and asked what they were doing. The man, polite but firm, told him the project was authorized through a microgrant for neighborhood runoff management. Matt asked to see the permit. The foreman handed him a clipboard. There it was. Karen's name listed under Community Planning Representative, approving a curb restructuring designed to allow better drainage from pedestrian cross-traffic, citing heavy foot use along corner green space. The permit showed stamped approval from a subcommittee in the Department of Streets and Drainage, a subcommittee chaired by, once again, a former colleague of Karen's from a now-defunct beautification initiative. The curb work wasn't on Matt's property, but it ran along the edge. And as part of the project, they would be lowering the sidewalk entry point by 6 inches and grading the slope downward, directly into the segment of lawn where the retractable deterrents were buried. If they completed the grading, water would pool there, potentially shorting the system and forcing Matt to tear it out or risk electrical hazards. He told them to stop. They said they couldn't. He called Gloria. She was already drafting an injunction by the time he sent over the permit copy, but paperwork moved slower than backhoes. Matt stood on the lawn while the machines began tearing into the sidewalk, knowing full well that by the time a court could pause the project, the physical damage would already be done. That night, he didn't sleep. He drafted a contingency, pulled the system offline manually, carefully uninstalled the retractable posts, and stored them in his garage. He didn't want anyone getting hurt in a trench filled with water and loosened power lines. But he documented everything: photos, footage, timestamps. At 3:42 a.m., the motion camera caught Karen walking across the now barren corner of his yard. No stumble this time. Just a slow walk, arms folded behind her back, her expression unreadable. The following morning, Matt was issued a citation. It had nothing to do with the project. It was for unsecured private hardware storage in a zone visible from public access. A local code violation with a fine attached. The complaint had been submitted less than 12 hours after the retractable units were placed in his garage, by someone who'd had to know they were there almost immediately. Matt paid the fine, then requested a hearing. Not because of the cost, but because of the pattern. By now, Gloria had begun connecting the threads more publicly. She compiled the incidents into a single report. Not a legal brief, but a narrative summary designed to show the flow of targeted administrative pressure. She sent it to the county ombudsman, to 2 local news editors she trusted, and to a regional watchdog group that monitored land use disputes. Not as a media story, just a signal. Karen, meanwhile, doubled down. 3 days after the grading was completed, she held an informal beautification walkthrough with 6 other residents. They strolled the sidewalk, took notes, made comments about how the neighborhood feels safer now that the path is open again, and discussed ideas about adding a bench or a small informational kiosk near the corner. Matt recorded them, said nothing, and sent the footage to Gloria. That weekend, someone scratched a message into the paint on the driver's side door of Matt's truck. Keep out. No witnesses, no prints. The camera feed had been interrupted, jammed for 3 minutes by a high-frequency burst from a device designed to overload low-bandwidth systems. It wasn't a teenager with a grudge. It was professional. Matt installed new cameras, higher grade with overlapping ranges and no wireless vulnerabilities. He rewired his garage. He changed his routines, left and returned at different times, altered the paths he walked, added motion-triggered strobes along the back fence. He didn't arm himself. He didn't need to. He just made it clear that he wouldn't be caught off guard again. And then, one evening near sunset, a city zoning official arrived at his door. Polite, calm, clipboard in hand. She said she was conducting a compliance check based on a series of cumulative reports. She wanted to inspect the garage, confirm it wasn't being used as a workshop in violation of local ordinances prohibiting commercial operation from a residentially zoned lot. Matt nearly laughed. He didn't. He simply pointed to the zoning exception stamped on his purchase agreement, the clause that permitted small-scale repair business activity due to the property's grandfathered status as a legacy use lot. The woman checked her list, nodded, apologized, and left. But Matt understood what that meant. They were trying to take his business now. Not directly, not with force, but piece by piece, through questions, citations, implications, and pressure. Karen wasn't just trying to control a lawn anymore. She was trying to remove a variable. Matt wasn't just a neighbor. He was a threat, because he'd said no, and because he'd made that no stick. So he made one more move of his own. He filed a civil harassment claim, not against Karen specifically, but against the pattern of behavior tied to her documented activity. It wasn't about money. It was about setting a precedent, drawing a legal line in the sand. And it sent a message, not just to Karen, but to everyone watching. He wasn't going anywhere. Not today. Not ever. By the time the subpoena reached Karen's mailbox, the leaves had begun to fall. Matt watched them drift down across the newly graded curb that had become the symbolic front line in a conflict that was no longer about grass or property lines. It had become a test of will, of who could endure, who could outlast, and who would blink first. But what Karen didn't yet realize was that her greatest weapon, social pressure, veiled threats, institutional manipulation, had begun to collapse under the weight of its own repetition. What had started as a subtle campaign of control had become too loud, too visible, too obvious for even the more cautious neighbors to ignore. Matt hadn't gone public. He hadn't turned the fight into a scandal. He didn't need to. The pattern spoke for itself, and now that pattern had entered the court system with real weight. Karen's official response to the harassment claim was filed by a high-end attorney whose firm handled civil disputes for clients accustomed to getting their way. The response was lengthy, full of flowery legal phrasing about misunderstood intentions, neighborhood engagement, and mischaracterized involvement. They tried to claim she had merely advised on community issues, that she had never directed any inspections or directly interfered with Matt's property. But their claims fell apart against the paper trail Gloria had assembled. Permits with Karen's signature, inspection requests traced to her email address, video footage of her trespassing on multiple occasions. It wasn't just evidence. It was a map of a campaign waged over weeks, with coordination, precision, and an unmistakable goal. The court granted Matt a preliminary protection order, barring Karen from direct or indirect interference with his property pending the full hearing. The order didn't come with cameras or officers. It came with weight. Suddenly, Karen's presence on the sidewalk became sparse. Her morning walks changed routes. The small gatherings outside her porch became less frequent. No one said anything outright, but Matt could feel it. A shift in the temperature of the block. She was still there, still watching, but now with less confidence. For the first time, Karen was in a position where her movements were being observed with legal consequence, and that was when she made her final, most desperate move. It came in the form of development. Matt woke to the sound of drilling, not at his property, but at the corner lot across the street, where a small patch of unused green space had sat for years, ignored by the city. Now, there were contractors surveying it, marking it, preparing it. Gloria was on the phone within hours, confirming that a private initiative had submitted a proposal to build a community welcome station on the lot. Small, decorative, seemingly harmless. A bench, a hydration post, a donation box, some informational signs about neighborhood values. On paper, it sounded like beautification. But Matt recognized the play immediately. The structure would face his lawn, designed to encourage foot traffic right back across the disputed corner. It was symbolic warfare disguised as public service. Karen had lost control of his property, so now she intended to make it impossible for him to maintain it without being seen as the one creating the problem. But Karen had misjudged something critical: timing. In her rush to retaliate before the hearing, she had bypassed one of the key steps in the city's planning process: public notice. The proposal had been fast-tracked through the Parks and Community Partnerships Department using an emergency grant that Karen herself had recommended months ago for a different site. Now that it had been repurposed, her signature was on every relevant document. That alone wasn't enough to stop the build. But the lie she told about its original purpose, claiming it was for a school-adjacent greenway when no such school existed within 5 blocks, was enough to trigger an ethics review. Gloria filed a motion to freeze the development until the review could be completed. In parallel, the private investigator submitted evidence showing that the same contractors who had done the grading work on Matt's curb had been prepaid in cash to begin the foundation work without city inspection. The city council, under pressure from several residents and with growing awareness of the now very visible feud, voted unanimously to suspend the Welcome Station's construction pending a full audit of Karen's community involvement. History. The hole was dug. The posts were never poured. Karen didn't show her face outside for 5 days after the decision. When she did, she wasn't smiling. She walked slowly, like someone moving through a house of cards, careful not to touch anything that might fall. She still had allies, people who believed in her version of order, who valued the neatness of her approach, but they no longer offered her the same enthusiastic support. Her strength had always come from certainty, from projecting inevitability. Now that projection was cracked. And then came the final blow, not from Matt but from the city itself. Following the audit of the failed construction attempt, the Department of Community Planning announced a formal investigation into the misuse of neighborhood development grants. Matt hadn't requested it. Gloria hadn't pursued it. It had come internally, triggered by overlapping signatures and suspicious budget reallocations. Karen's name was on 3 proposals, all tied to closed initiatives that had been redirected without public disclosure. Whether it was sloppiness or arrogance, she had left a trail, and now the trail had become public record. The hearing for Matt's harassment case was set for early winter. The courtroom wasn't dramatic, no press, just a judge, 2 attorneys, and a room full of folders. Gloria presented the pattern. Karen's attorney argued for intent. But what decided the matter wasn't emotion. It was exhaustion. The judge, a pragmatic woman with years of experience in civil conflict, read through the evidence, listened to both sides, and simply said, "This is not neighborhood mediation. This is sustained coercion." The ruling was clear. Karen was barred from contacting, influencing, or involving herself in any aspect of Matt's property, his business, or his city correspondence. Any further attempt to do so would be treated as contempt of court. Karen left the room without a word. Her attorney didn't follow. Matt didn't feel victorious. What he felt was space, the quiet kind that follows when pressure finally lifts. The lawn, now mostly recovered, was his again. The spike system remained in storage, no longer necessary. The cameras stayed, but not as weapons. Just quiet guardians of a boundary that had finally been respected. Neighbors began to return slowly, offering nods again, conversations in passing, the small rituals of a street trying to right itself after too long in tension. Karen remained in her house. The lights were on, the drapes pulled tight. Her power hadn't vanished. It had retreated, pulled back into the walls that had once held sway over the street. But she was no longer a presence in motion. She was static now. A closed circuit. Matt didn't need to confront her again. The law had done that for him. Not loudly, not with spectacle, but with permanence. And that, more than anything else, was what he'd wanted from the beginning. Not victory, just peace, earned, durable, and undeniable. Winter came late that year, drifting in slowly like a guest unsure of their welcome. The grass on Matt's lawn yellowed and stiffened under the cold, but he didn't mind. It didn't matter that the colors faded, or that the flower beds now lay dormant under tarp and mulch. What mattered was the silence, that long, undisturbed hush that had finally returned to his corner of the street. For the first time in months, no anonymous letters appeared in his mailbox. No early morning workers measured lines at the curb, and no unfamiliar shoes trampled diagonally across his lawn like it was a hallway. Matt had kept the boundary, and now the boundary kept him. The cameras still ran, more from habit than paranoia, quietly documenting a world that no longer threatened to close in. He rarely checked the footage now because there was nothing left to watch. The tension that once charged the very air outside his front door had dissipated. Not suddenly, but thoroughly, leaving behind only the echo of conflict, one that neither side could forget, but only one side had tried to win through erosion. Karen remained where she had always been, behind her windows, behind her plans, behind the thin curtain of control she had spent years weaving out of meetings and signatures and social pressure. But something fundamental had changed. She no longer spoke for the street. Her newsletters stopped arriving. The decorations she used to meticulously place on holidays were absent. The porch lights, once always on, now flickered inconsistently or remained dark altogether. People no longer paused at her steps. Conversations didn't end when she stepped outside. Matt never saw her in person again after the hearing. Maybe she still walked, but not here. Not past his lawn. That ritual had ended the moment she realized her steps were no longer silent. that they left prints that someone could follow back. Neighbors who had once kept their distance began acknowledging him more openly. A retired electrician from the next block stopped by one morning to talk shop about vintage voltage regulators. A young couple new to the area asked for a referral on fencing. Even Dennis, who had always floated in the middle, invited Matt to a small street cleanup day with nothing more than a shrug and the words, "Figured you're not the type to leave a mess." Matt didn't say much during these interactions, but he accepted them, knowing that normalcy wasn't something you forced. It was something you rebuilt piece by piece, like a wall, this time not to defend, but to outline something worth keeping intact. One afternoon in early January, a letter arrived. This time it was from the city, and it wasn't a warning, a notice, or a complaint. It was a certificate, formal, embossed, signed by a representative of the Department of Property Rights and Urban Boundary Oversight. It recognized Matt's contribution to the legal clarification of transitional land zones within single-lot residential areas, citing his case as precedent in favor of non-communal use protection in high-pressure planning districts. Gloria had pushed for the acknowledgement, not for his pride, but for the next person who might not have the resources or clarity to defend their home as thoroughly. Matt placed the certificate in a drawer and didn't hang it. Not out of humility, but because he already knew what he had protected. He didn't need a frame to prove it. In the end, it wasn't about Karen. Not really. She had been the force, but not the root. What she represented, the belief that enough influence could replace consent, that persistence could override ownership, was what Matt had truly resisted. And he had done so not with spectacle, not with viral exposure or shouting matches, but with steady resistance, with facts, with silence when necessary and action when required. It wasn't revenge, it was restraint. That's what made it hold. Because in a neighborhood like theirs, where people had to keep seeing each other no matter what, the only victory that mattered was one that didn't leave the whole block in ruin. As winter deepened and frost crawled along the eaves, Matt finally unboxed the retractable spike system. He didn't reinstall it. He didn't need to. He cleaned it carefully, packed it in oiled cloth, and stored it in a reinforced crate at the back of the garage. Not as a threat, as memory. A reminder that peace wasn't something given. It was something held. And when necessary, something defended. Not with force, but with readiness. And not to push people out, but to protect the line between shared space and personal ground. The lawn would regrow in spring. So would the quiet. So would the understanding between neighbors, spoken or not, that some lines don't move just because someone's used to crossing them. And when those lines hold, they protect more than property. They protect the idea that boundaries, once declared and respected, are what make peace possible in the first place.